Have you heard of this show, Miss Mosaic from Nickelodeon in 2002? The chances are slim because the show canceled after airing just 6 20-minute episodes. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, let me explain. Miss Mosaic is an educational children's show. Please keep in mind that this isn't one of those cliched lost episode crap stories that has static blood and gore, blah blah blah. Miss Mosaic isn't even close to having those cheesy horror stories you find scattered around across the internet. And I'm certainly not begging for you to believe me and all that crap. If you want, look it up. Miss Mosaic is a woman, obviously, who is made out of small colored square stones. It wasn't animated, mind you. It was stop motion. Miss Mosaic would elegantly move and dance with her voice, was quite literally a chorus angel. She wore sky blue belly dancer-like clothes and had gotten jewels decorating her graceful body. Her caramel skin seemed to have shined over more than the other small stones. Her eyes were deep dark red-blue, and her voice sequence followed with each word that was poured out of her lips perfectly. Even if you hate educational shows, you'd been aware of how all these shows have done with the utmost care. It seemed to have cherished by the employees who worked on it. Nevertheless, the show seemed extremely entertaining for children's ages between 3 and 12. In fact, parents reported that their children were addicted to the show. Parents would claim that their child would gain great knowledge, and immediately the show was made skyrocketed to the top of the list. So why? Why would they cancel the show? It was perfectly produced. The artwork of Miss Mosaic was stunning, and the music was absolutely great. Miss Mosaic would teach the children fun math problems and had them sing with her while dancing and jumping. Like I said before, there wasn't anything graphic scenes or static that appears in the show. In fact, none of those stones, even in the red colors on them. Around episode 4, the popularity of Miss Mosaic was booming and still growing. All the reviews were 5 stars, always holding similar descriptions. Wow, how my daughter loves this, or my kids don't even watch cartoons anymore and they read books all the time, and so forth. After episode 4, parents were starting to show concern. Families were calling Nickelodeon, complaining that their child only spoke of topics such as science. Now, you might ask, how is that a bad thing? Well, parents of the children continued saying their child would gaze at their food and not even take small bites of it, and begin murmuring numbers and words. Child's voice would grow louder and louder until the parents could hear it clearly. The child would be rambling about gravity and inhuman anomaly, and saying things about how many heartbeats we may have left until we, disturbingly enough, died. The children would tell his or her parents of how many breaths we take when we sleep, and the list goes on. The child would speak in gibberish, and even the almost intelligible parents didn't understand. The child would continue this for about a minute before shutting their mouth completely. Just like that. Not what you expected, right? You probably thought the child was going to start screaming at the top of their lungs and their eyes would be crying blood or something like that. No, they just stopped and went back to normal. Yes, the child went back to his or her average self. When their parents asked about what their outburst was, they would only reply with a soft smile, nod, and would only say these few words. Miss Mosaic taught me. Whenever the parents would ask again, the child would simply ignore the topic entirely. Majority at Nickelodeon already thought about canceling the show, but of course you've yet assholes that work for Nickelodeon. Unfortunately for those good-for-nothing jerks that will rant and bash about the creator until they drive him or her to insanity. It seemed as the other employees went along with it. I'll admit that Nickelodeon did pull a douchey move, and they also pulled another one. They complained on their whole website that calls even never occurred. Yes, they completely put the incidents of them at the back of their minds, but there were only around 20 unusual calls about the children's outbursts. So of course dull-minded fans believed Nickelodeon lies. There weren't any calls like that ever again, and the show continued like nothing ever happened. Even employees seemed to believe that incident over and never happened. Due to the lack of conversation about it, Ms. Mosaic would be aired on national television every Wednesday, and barely cost any money, because Ms. Mosaic's set was medium budget. due to the fact that there was only one camera pointed towards Miss Mosaic and the Mosaic sky behind her. That was it. Of course, there would have to be hundreds and hundreds of frames put together and such, but nevertheless, the animators enjoyed it. The voice actor for Miss Mosaic was happy with her job, and everything seemed to be perfect. Episode 5 was likely any other episode, where Miss Mosaic taught the young viewers how to twirl and sing ABCs. Mind you that, of course, adults would sit in the room and watch the show with their child. Adults claimed that Miss Mosaic said these words, "Let's play hide and seek." She would gleefully yell. The children would then hide somewhere in the room, usually a nook and a cranny. A big smile plastered on their faces as they peered out from the hiding spots to see Miss Mosaic hiding, looking around the screen, searching for the hider. She would be completely oblivious to the adult or teenager present in the room. In fact, it seemed that she tried her very best not to look at the people from ages 13 and above. Then after a few minutes, she would open her mouth and say, "Gotcha!" She would play it in a victorious tone as she pointed towards the hiding spot of the child. The child would then proceed to come out of their hiding spot and show that they would go on like normal. If you didn't analyze what I just said, let's overview quickly. How did Miss Mosaic knew where the child was hiding? Miss Mosaic began gathering horror gurists everywhere after that, and the rumors and the stories were spreading like the plague. These occurrences in the show were just too strange, out of this world. Those were the only words that can describe this show. There were also countless stories about Miss Mosaic would come out of the television and brutally murder the children. No one believed the hide and seek scene, except for the people who actually saw the episode, which was surprisingly very little. Miss Mosaic played a very early, mind you, and the adults were probably getting ready for another day of work. I even noticed that Miss Mosaic played on days where the children didn't have to go to school, or when families were busy working. Miss Mosaic was quickly becoming famous in the horror community. Again, everything went back to normal. The episodes only aired once for some reason. I never knew why they only played one episode every Wednesday. Then episode 6 finally came out after a long wait, and curious minds wanted to investigate. Didn't they miss opportunity to see the episode of Miss Mosaic, because they fully knew that they only had one chance of viewing the episode. Midway through the episode, the Mosaic halted in her tracks. So did the children. She just stood there and stared at the camera. She wasn't completely motionless, just like in real life when someone was staring at someone else. Their face twitches, eyes drift around, their eyebrows move slightly. That's what Miss Mosaic was doing. And at this point, the elder people in the room became concerned by the fact that their child was just standing there, eyes fixated on the screen. There had been cases where the child was originally sitting down watching the show, but when Miss Mosaic mysteriously stopped, the children's expression would drop and they stand up. Miss Mosaic's eyes darted around the room, as if she was trying to stare at the thousands of viewers at the same time. She would pierce her lips and clamp her jaw shut. Slowly her neutral expression turned into a frown. Then her mouth would slowly open, revealing rotten, sickly yellow teeth, which she did not have before. She would then try to crack her neck, not in a humane way. She did the same motions we do when we wake up in the morning, moving our heads and shoulders around in an attempt to crack our cramped necks. After she did that, there was a loud, sickening crack. She gritted her teeth, scraping them against each other as they began stretching her body across the crooked way possible. Yet she glanced her movements, most of the due to those of a snake. She trembled slowly, and small mosaic stones, paint chipped off and became dull, revealing thin cracked stones beneath those colorful patterns. By now she had a look of pure anger formed on her now pale face. Her cheeks were sunken and her eyes were slightly swollen and bloodshot. The children were still locked in place. The soundtrack for the show was barely audible, and there was pain in her eyes. Finally, with a snap of her neck, she smiled, or at least she tried to. Her broken, parched lips made a smiling look painful. She tilted her head and said in her normal soft voice, "Miss Mosaic's daily lesson, how to heal sick people," she joyfully announced. The children were once frozen, would suddenly start laughing and jumping. Miss Mosaic would instruct the child to poke her on the forehead and she kept decaying her appearance the way you could imagine that the older person who was present was absolutely terrified to the brim. However, witnesses claimed that an unknown force made their muscles clench and form a knot in their stomachs and squeezed, as if they tried to stand up or run towards the child to get them all out of there. They couldn't. Even if they tried, their bodies would feel strained. Finally, when the children poked Miss Mosaic head, in a split second she reverted back to her normal appearance. The child didn't get sucked in or anything like that. Miss Mosaic was indeed healed. After that, people of ages from 13 and above would be fully back in control. This time Nickelodeon couldn't even try to ignore the incident or cover up. Like before, phone calls flooded the Nickelodeon studios. They officially knew Miss Mosaic was screwed. However, they admitted that no one made Miss Mosaic to do these things, like healing scene was around 11 minutes and 36 seconds in length. When Nickelodeon staff went to the period of time to the episode check, nothing odd showed up. Even though they proved the scene never happened, they still had no choice but to shut down Miss Mosaic due to the lack of viewership and demanding parents. And just like that, the show went off air. Sure, people still talked about it, but it seemed that Miss Mosaic went on in the back of their minds. Of course, horror stories covered Miss Mosaic so completely that everyone thought it was a hoax. Nickelodeon had countless arrays of the shows to view anyway, so they had a problem with one losing show. One of my friends who was a victim to Miss Mosaic had to watch her daughter stand and poke her forehead what seemed to be a monster. She told me that her child never spoke of Miss Mosaic again, but she told me one thing I can never forget. At first I thought she was joking, but the look of sincerity in her voice told me that otherwise. She said that one night she was going back home from another day at work when she fell down a small bumpy sharp hill and got injured in the process. Once she was home, her husband immediately put her in bed as she was bedridden. When she fell asleep, she told me she woke up in the middle of the night. She told me that the dimly lit room, illuminated by the moonlight, she could see a figure of her daughter holding up one finger and her other hand hanging loosely, and she could vaguely make out the shape of the bottle of pills in her hand.